billionaire, haunted by the mysterious death of his son, unexpectedly encounters a homeless girl at the cemetery. She says, "I was Nate's friend. He told me that if anything ever happened to him, I should find you." From that moment on, buried truths begin to surface, and a long-forgotten promise is awakened. The wind howled through the towering pines at Hillside Memorial Cemetery, as if nature itself were mourning alongside him. The sky hung heavy and gray, and the first snowflakes of the season fell like whispers from the unseen realm. Standing before a gravestone etched with the name Nathaniel Langston, Richard gripped his black leather gloves tightly, a bouquet of white flowers still intact in his hands. 5 years. 5 years since the moment his world crumbled with a single phone call. An accident. His boy, his only son, whom he'd once thought too young to die, had been struck by a car near the school after baseball practice. The report concluded it was a drunk driver's fault, but to Richard, that death wasn't just a statistic. It was a silent life sentence, a crack in his chest that would never heal. He knelt down, placing the flowers on the cold headstone. "Hey, Nate," he said, his voice hoarse, dissolving into the wind like an old secret. "I'm sorry for everything." Just as he was about to stand, a faint sound stopped him in his tracks. A sniffle. He turned. Behind the gravestone, a small figure emerged. A little girl, her hair tangled by the wind, her thin dress clinging to her from melting snow, sat curled up like a tattered leaf blown here by the storm. No shoes, no coat, just wide red-rimmed eyes, swollen from cold and tears. Richard froze. His first instinct was that she must be lost, but then her gaze met his. Wary, trembling, yet somehow not unfamiliar. There was something as if she knew him. "Little one?" His voice softened, cautious. "What are you doing out here in this weather? Are you lost?" She didn't answer right away. A gust of wind swept through, making her small frame shiver violently. Her bluish-purple hands clutched at herself. "I'm sorry." Her voice came out thin, like a wisp of breath. "I didn't mean for you to see me. I just came to talk to Nate." Richard held his breath. "Nate?" he repeated, as if the name had never left his heart. The girl nodded, her eyes gleaming with raw, piercing honesty. "He was my friend, my only friend. Whenever I was sad, he'd give me bread, sit and talk with me. No one else ever did that." She lowered her head. He said, "If anything ever happened to him, I should find his dad. You're his dad, aren't you?" Richard's world tilted. No one, not a single soul, had ever told him that Nate knew a homeless girl. In all the conversations they'd had, in the pages of the journal he'd tried to read after his son's death, there wasn't a trace of a friend like this. His heart pounded, a chaotic mix of doubt and something that felt dangerously like hope. "What's your name?" he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make her vanish like a mirage. "Lila," she replied. "Lila Carter?" Richard stared at her as if she'd just stepped out of another world, a world Nate had never let him enter. "Where do you live? Where are your parents?" Lila's face darkened. A silence colder than the snow settled between them. "My mom got sick and didn't wake up. Dad said he couldn't handle it and left. I live behind Trinity Church, in an old bus." Richard's heart clenched. Anger surged, not at her but at himself and at the cruel world that let a child live like this. Yet amid the chaos, one thing rang clear. Lila had mattered to Nate, deeply. He shrugged off his overcoat and draped it over her frail shoulders. Lila clutched the edge of it as if it were her entire world. "You don't have to apologize for being here," Richard said, his voice low and resolute. "From now on, you're not alone anymore." Lila looked up, her eyes wide and glistening with confusion. "Why? Are you being nice to me?" He took a deep breath, the wind cutting across his face, but he no longer felt the cold. "Because you mattered to Nate," he said, his eyes burning with a deep, aching pain. "And because Nate was everything to me." The black SUV glided smoothly through the quiet late winter streets. Streetlights cast golden reflections onto the cold glass buildings, stretching long shadows like memories yet to fade. Inside the car, Richard Langston sat in silence, his eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror where Lila huddled, still wrapped tightly in the thick coat he'd given her as they left the cemetery. She said nothing. Her wide eyes stared into the darkness beyond the window, as if trying to hold on to something this world was about to snatch away. When the car turned into the gates of the Langston estate, motion sensor lights flared to life along the stone-paved driveway. Lila gripped the door handle, as if afraid of being swept into a world that didn't belong to her. Richard turned off the engine, stepped out first, then gently opened her door. "You're safe now, Lila," he said, his tone so soft it seemed only the wind could hear. "There's nothing to be afraid of." She hesitated, then slowly climbed out. The sprawling mansion radiated a strange, gentle warmth, not the kind she was used to, but the warmth of a place that once echoed with laughter, once held life, and now cradled only memories. Richard led Lila through the main hall, where the dark, polished wooden floor reflected their every step. She glanced around as if searching for traces of her old friend. "The living room's this way," Richard said, gesturing, then pausing. "And over there, that's Nate's room. I've kept everything the same." Those words made Lila stop. Her gaze grew distant. "Can I see it?" He nodded. "Whenever you're ready." He settled her into a room near the balcony, where golden light spilled across the carpet and watercolor paintings hung gently on the walls. She stepped inside like someone walking on the moon, slightly touching the pillows, the blankets, then slipped beneath them as if afraid that any delay might make it all vanish like a dream. Richard lingered at the door, uncertain. "If you need anything, just call," he said, then quietly closed the door. He thought that was it for the night, but less than 10 minutes later, a soft knock sounded at the library door where he sat, his hands absently tracing the spine of Nate's old journal. Lila peeked in, her tangled hair spilling over her shoulders, her eyes shimmering as if on the verge of tears. "I found this." In her hands was a small, crumpled piece of paper, its edges worn and torn. Richard looked up, his heart suddenly racing. She held it out with both hands, like a sacred offering. "I found it in Nate's coat pocket, the one you gave me at the cemetery." It was folded up, tucked deep inside. Richard took it. His hands trembled slightly. The handwriting on the paper was messy, the ink smudged in places as if it had once been wet, but he recognized it instantly. Nate's handwriting, his son's. He read the lines slowly. "If anything happens to me, please, Dad, find Lila. Don't let her disappear like I never knew her. She deserves someone to protect her." Below was a shorter, hastily added line. "I trust you'll do the right thing. Like you always taught me." Richard gripped the paper as if it were the last thread keeping him from unraveling. His breath came in ragged bursts. An image of Nate flashed in his mind. Not the little boy he once knew, but a young man who thought of others, who planned ahead, and who feared. Feared what? He looked up at Lila. She stood silently, her hands clutching the hem of her coat, waiting to see what he'd do with this secret. "Did you know why Nate wrote this?" he asked softly. Lila shook her head. "I only know he was really sad that day. Something was bothering him, but..." "He didn't say." Richard nodded slowly. Part of him wanted to ask more. Another part feared the answer. But one thing was certain. This was no longer a coincidence. Nate had left a message. Nate had been afraid of something. And now, Lila was the final piece. He looked at her, his gaze shifting, not just pity anymore, but responsibility, and a promise. "Lila," he said, his voice firm with resolve, "I won't let Nate's promise go to waste. From now on, you won't have to disappear." Lila gave a small nod. In her tear-filled eyes, something new flickered for the first time. Not fear, not doubt, but trust. The next morning, faint sunlight filtered through the living room curtains, casting a warm eggshell glow across the wooden floor. But Richard Langston felt no warmth. He hadn't slept all night. Nate's note lay on the table like a knife lodged deep in his heart, the final message from a son he thought he'd known, but now realized he'd barely understood. Downstairs, the faint scent of toasted bread wafted from the kitchen. It was something Richard never imagined he'd experience again, cooking breakfast for someone other than himself. He hadn't anticipated that someone would be a girl who once slept in an old bus, shivering through cold nights. Lila, the last aching piece Nate had left behind. She sat at the dining table, her tangled hair loosely tied back with an old ribbon he'd found in a drawer. Before her was a plate of slightly burnt pancakes and a look of confusion mixed with gratitude. "Did you sleep okay?" Richard asked, sitting across from her. Lila nodded faintly. "I dreamed about Nate, but this time he was smiling." Richard tightened his grip on the ceramic mug in his hand. "Where did you first meet Nate?" "The park," she answered without hesitation. "Near his school. I'd sit there every afternoon after Mom passed. He saw me hungry and brought me a sandwich. Then he came back every day." Richard swallowed hard. The son he'd thought cared only about baseball and science books had quietly done something he'd never taught him: to see a person where others saw only a burden. "He said," Lila went on, "I wasn't invisible. That, just because people ignored me, didn't mean I didn't deserve to be seen." Her words pierced through the weathered armor around Richard's heart like a needle. "Do you remember the last time you saw Nate?" he asked, his voice softening, though his eyes sharpened like a blade. Lila fell silent for a moment. Then she set her fork down, her hands clasping together on the table as if holding on to a secret she wasn't yet ready to unlock. "That day, it was raining. I was sitting under the park's overhang. Nate came, but he was late. His face was tense, not like usual." "Tense?" Richard frowned. "He had argued with someone? A boy named Dylan? I heard them yelling. Dylan was really mad, saying Nate was ruining everything, doing something stupid, but Nate just kept saying, 'I won't stay quiet, people need to know.'" A chill ran through Richard. He didn't know much about Dylan, only vaguely recalled him as Nate's best friend from middle school. But never, not once, had Nate mentioned any conflict. "What happened next?" he pressed. "Dylan stormed off. Nate came over to me, soaked like a drowned rat. But he still smiled, gave me the rest of his sandwich. Then he said, 'If anything happens, promise you'll find my dad. He's good, he's just forgotten it.'" A thick silence flooded the room. Richard looked at Lila, a 10-year-old girl whose eyes carried the sorrow of a soul that had walked through darkness. She didn't fully grasp what she'd heard, but Richard did, and his heart began to question what he'd once accepted as the truth. The accident report had been neatly written. Nathaniel Langston was struck while crossing the street, caused by a drunk driver. No criminal factors involved. No one had asked why a model student was walking alone in the rain. No one had wondered if he'd been followed. No one had asked about Dylan. "Lila," Richard said, sitting up straighter, his eyes now glinting with the cold resolve of a father unwilling to endure in silence any longer. "Do you know Dylan's last name?" "Ross," she replied softly. "Dylan Ross. His dad does something with construction," Nate once said. "If the school collapses, a lot of people will get hurt." I didn't fully understand, but Richard did. A memory clicked into place. Nate had once mentioned joining a volunteer project to check the safety of school buildings, an internship, something Richard had dismissed as trivial compared to his own grand conference presentations. Now the scattered pieces began to fit together. A vague picture emerged. A boy who'd uncovered something he shouldn't have, a threat spat out in panic, and an accident that happened all too conveniently. "I'll find out everything," Richard said, his gaze fixed on the window pane beyond. "If someone pushed my son into his grave, I won't let it sink into silence. Lila looked at him. For the first time, she saw in this man not just grief, but life rekindling, as if a heart that had slept for 5 years was waking up. That night, the Langston estate was no longer cloaked in its usual stillness. The library lights burned late into the night. Richard sat before his computer screen, its cold glow illuminating his haggard but fiercely focused face. Nate's note lay beside him, next to a printed file from 5 years ago. The accident that had stolen his son. For the first time since the funeral, Richard revisited every detail: time, location, street map, the driver's name, witness statements, and for the first time he noticed strange gaps that he'd been too numb to question before. No one had seen the accident happen. No one had asked why Nate was walking alone in the rain at an hour when he should have been home, and no one, absolutely no one, had mentioned Dylan Ross. Richard pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd long erased from his contacts. A gravelly voice answered after 2 rings. "Langston? Ben, I need you." Ben Vargas, a former criminal investigator turned discreet private detective. They'd worked together on a corporate lawsuit years ago. Richard trusted no one else, not when it came to his son. "You still have connections at the precinct?" "Always." "Then help me dig up my son's death. I think it wasn't just an accident." Vargas didn't ask questions. He agreed to meet the next morning, but within 36 hours everything changed. When Richard opened the file Vargas brought, his heart felt like it was being crushed. New witness notes, from people who only now spoke up. When someone finally asked again, a park security guard confirmed. There were 2 boys arguing loudly that day. One shouted, "You're ruining my dad's career." A street vendor recalled, "I saw a kid in a red jacket get shoved hard, then minutes later I heard a car horn." I didn't connect the 2 until I learned who died that day, and most chilling of all was what tied to Paul Ross, Dylan's father, the CEO of one of the state's largest construction firms. His company had secured a contract to renovate the main support beams of the school where Nate was interning for a safety inspection. Nate's inspection notes, unearthed by Vargas in a photocopy, stated clearly, "The steel beams in Building B show signs of rust and structural weakness, at risk of collapse within 6 months if not reinforced." A simple report, but one that carried the weight of a death sentence. Nate had planned to submit it to the school board the following week. He never got the chance. Richard slammed the file shut, his hands trembling. The study felt too small to contain the roar building inside him. He stepped out into the garden, where Lila sat on a swing beneath a maple tree. Silver moonlight bathed her face like a thin layer of frost. She turned her head at the sound of his footsteps. "Lila," he took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something. It might be hard to remember." She nodded slowly. In her eyes there was no fear, only absolute loyalty to Nate. "Do you remember what Dylan said that day? Before he left?" Lila looked down at her hands, then whispered, "He said, 'If you dare speak up, you'll ruin everything. My dad will lose it all. I won't let that happen.'" Richard's heart sank. "And then?" Nate just quietly said, "I can't ignore it. If people get hurt, I'll do what's right." She paused. "Dylan," shoved his shoulder hard, but Nate stood firm. Then Dylan walked away. After that, I don't know. That was the last time anyone saw Nate alive. 3 days later, Dylan Ross was summoned to the police station for questioning at the formal request of Richard and Detective Vargas. In a cold, white room, he slumped forward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. After 2 hours of denials, Dylan finally broke. He confessed to following Nate after their argument, afraid he'd report the findings that night. Near the intersection, they fought again. In a panic, Dylan shoved Nate. Nate stumbled, lost his balance, and the car came. I didn't think I just wanted him to stop. I didn't mean." But no one means to kill their friend until the truth is laid bare too late. The news spread quickly, but Richard didn't face the media. He stood silently by the library window, clutching a photo of Nate, his son's eyes still gazing into a future, still believing the truth would prevail. For the first time in 5 years, he felt pain so sharp it made him feel alive again. No more doubts, no more gaps. Only one truth remained. His son had died for doing the right thing, and now it was his turn to carry on. That afternoon, the wind was gentler. The sky no longer loomed with the gloom of past days. Instead, it wore a soft, hazy light, the kind that only appears after a fierce storm has passed. Richard Langston stood by the mansion's door, holding a single white rose, waiting for Lila. She emerged from the hallway, wrapped in a thick, well-fitted sweater, her hair neatly combed and tied to one side. In the backlight, she no longer resembled the homeless child he'd met by Nate's grave. She was something vibrant and very much a part of his family. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle, as if afraid to shatter the fragile air. She nodded. "Today is the last day he talked to me." Her voice was small, like a breeze slipping through leaves. "I want to say thank you." The car rolled out of the gate. No music, no noise, just two people, one grown, one small, heading together to where someone they both loved once belonged. Hillside Cemetery was as quiet as before, but this time there was no snow, no bone-chilling cold. The ground was blanketed with golden leaves, and the air carried the damp scent of pine. Richard and Lila stood before Nate's grave, a simple headstone, clean and somehow gentle, like the smile of the boy in the few photos that remained. He knelt down, placing the white rose at the center of the stone. Then he spoke softly. "Son, I found her. You kept your word. Now it's my turn." The space fell silent for a few seconds. The wind whispered like a distant melody from long ago. Lila stepped forward, clutching a piece of paper folded into quarters. She knelt, placing it beside the white rose, and looked up at the headstone as if in conversation. "Nate, I didn't know what to write. I'm not good with words, but I remember. You said just living well was enough." Her voice broke. But she didn't cry. These weren't tears of fear or hunger anymore. They were the tears of someone loved again. "I have a bed now, books, someone who listens, and I have Uncle Richard." She glanced back at him. Richard had turned his face away, not from the cold, but because his eyes blurred, for the first time in years. "You said your dad was good. He'd just forgotten," Lila whispered. "Now he remembers." She stepped back, squeezing Richard's hand. He bent down, one arm wrapping around her, the other resting lightly on her shoulder. A hand that, once fumbled, unsure how to connect with his own son, now a steady anchor for another child. They stood like that for a long while, letting the wind carry away what words couldn't express. As they prepared to leave, Lila turned back one last time, pulling an old silver necklace from her pocket, the only gift her mother had ever left her. She placed it on the headstone and said softly, "You were the first to see me not as trash. I want you to have something of mine, too." Richard said nothing. He knew this was the final exchange between two souls. One gone, one redeemed. On the drive back, the car glided silently between rows of trees shedding their leaves, but inside, the space felt warmer. "Uncle Richard," Lila's voice broke the stillness. "If I wanted to stay here forever, would you let me?" He turned to look at her. His eyes didn't need words. They held more than a simple yes. "You're home," he said very quietly, "from the moment my son wrote your name in that letter." That evening, Richard didn't work. He sat reading through Nate's old journal pages that once hurt too much to open. For the first time, he didn't see them as mere memories. They were an emotional will, streams of love Nate had left behind, for him, for Lila, and for himself. Outside, the wind rustled gently through the maple leaves. On the table by the window, a drawing Lila had just finished was drying, its watercolors still settling. 3 figures, a man, a girl, and a young man standing between them, his hands touching both their shoulders. Behind them, a white bird soared upward. That morning, sunlight poured into the garden behind the Langston estate like warm honey. Sparrows chirped atop the white picket fence, and newly planted lavender sprigs swayed in the gentle early spring breeze. Richard stood on the stone steps, adjusting his gray tie. It had been a long time since he'd worn a suit, even longer since he'd hosted an event with so many people, but today, it wasn't like the old parties. Today was Nate's 18th birthday. The day he should have stepped into adulthood. He didn't let himself finish the thought. In the garden, preparations were underway for a small ceremony. No extravagant banners, no media lenses, just people who'd known Nate, old classmates, teachers, neighbors, and others who'd only recently learned of him through a quiet story that surfaced weeks ago. Billionaire adopts homeless girl, reveals secret friendship after son's death. Richard didn't care about the headlines. He only knew he was keeping a promise. A small section of the garden had been transformed into a memorial, a young maple tree planted beside Nate's old stone bench. Above it, words were carved. A legacy isn't what we leave behind, it's who we touch. Lila stood by the maple, holding a small cage. Inside was a white dove, tilting its head with an oddly serene calm. She wore a simple white dress, her hair neatly braided, her face glowing as if washed by both tears and morning light. No one would guess this was the girl who once slept under a bus seat trembling in the snowy night. All eyes turned to her, but Lila sought only one, Richard's. When he gave a slight nod, she stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but it was clear. "I'm Lila Carter. I don't know much about speeches, but I know Nate changed my life just because he saw me." A pause hung in the air. He wasn't rich like his dad. He wasn't powerful, but he had something not everyone has: kindness without conditions. Lila took a deep breath. Her hand unlatched the cage. "I'm releasing this bird, not to say goodbye, but to remind myself. Kindness can fly too, and if someone was ever kind to me, I'll pass it on." The dove's wings spread wide. It flapped a few strong beats, then soared upward, circling the maple's canopy before climbing higher until it was just a white speck against the blue sky. In that sunlight, Lila smiled. Richard turned his face away, once again, because he didn't want anyone to see a man once known as a steel icon of finance shedding tears. When it was his turn to speak, Richard stepped forward with a paper in hand, but he didn't need it. He looked straight at the people before him and said, "There are two kinds of legacies we can leave. One is wealth, easy to count, easy to lose. The other is kindness, hard to measure, but never runs dry." He paused. His gaze settled on Lila, the living proof of everything he was about to say. "Nate, my son, chose the second kind. And that saved a life, saved a soul, and saved me too." Scattered applause rose up, not loud, just enough to affirm someone had heard, someone understood. That afternoon, as the ceremony ended, Richard and Lila sat on the steps, sharing lemonade and a basket of cookies brought by one of Nate's old friends. "Do you think he's watching all this from somewhere?" Lila asked. "I hope so," Richard said with a faint smile. "And if he is, he's probably grumbling right now because I wore the wrong color tie." They both laughed. A laugh without cracks, without hidden pain. A laugh of family.